The Roman Empire was at the peak of its power in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. The complete control of the Mediterranean facilitated trade, meaning that all their land was connected under one system. Furthermore, they had established a strong bureaucratic system. However, the Roman Empire as we know it was a pile of rubble just a few hundred years later. Due to many influences from Germanic tribesmen to Diocletian's reforms, Rome was not able to stand its ground. Although these forces would not have ended Rome by themselves, the pressures that they placed on the empire was too much for the government and the people to handle.
After the fall of the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire went through a period called the Pax Romana, where they established political stability through a stable bureaucracy, economic integration through an established trade system, and urbanization of new cities and the growth of pre-established cities. Then, during the 3rd century, everything fell apart. Due to factors such as Germanic tribes becoming stronger and more of a threat, less military expansion that caused the revenue that normally comes from conquering to dry up, a disease that wiped out 10% of the population, and the dangerous power of troops in the military, Rome fell into crisis during the 3rd century. To solve this, a man named Diocletian came forward and made some reforms. He created military reforms that made it harder for soldiers to rebel, and administrative reforms that made it easier for the large empire to be governed. He made legions of the army stronger so they had a harder time teaming up and getting the large numbers they would need for a successful rebellion. He split the military into 2 parts, one that was mobile and one that was stationary, and recruited more Germanic tribesmen. He also established a civil government and military government as 2 separate entities, so that no one could have both the money of the state and the military power and be able to use those 2 things to start a rebellion. For his administrative reforms, he decided to divide the empire into 2 halves, east and west. Each half had 2 empires, one in charge and one in support. While in the short term, these reforms helped the empire, in the long term, it made things worse. He made the military more reliant on Germanic tribesmen who weren't Romans but Rome relied on for protection. While his division of each half of the empire during having 2 emperors fell apart, his split of the empire stuck around and caused many issues. The east side of the empire contained the older Greek cities and had more money and more people and had more trade routes throughout. They had a more stable government that was able to better deal with internal conflicts such as religious issues. They could support more military efforts through the taxation of their people and because they could recruit more people into the military without significantly lowering the amount of people making money and causing economic stimulation. The West, on the other hand, didn't have as much people or money and couldn't support bigger military efforts they desperately needed, since they were geographically more exposed to Germanic tribes in the East, which had natural borders. The East was mainly exposed to Persia, which was fairly governmentally sound and easy to deal with. The East could also pay off Germanic tribes to leave them alone, while the West could not. The West's lack of resources needed to support the much-needed military caused many problems for the Western Rome Empire.
Many economic problems in Western Rome began after Rome stopped conquering. Previously, Rome had a steady flow of newly conquered land and a new batch of conquered people to force into slavery. However, when they stopped conquering, the steady flow of resources that people in Western Rome depended on was no longer there. Additionally, disease played a role in the crashing economy. As more and more people died, there were less people who had jobs to keep the economy stable. Productivity had also been decreasing due to drought, overworked land, and overtaxation of farmers. The government needed funds for their military and needed to fix the already declining economy, so they made silver coins cheaper and raised taxes on people. This caused people in Western Rome to stop working as hard, and productivity was greatly decreased. However, as productivity decreased, food became more scarce and expensive, resulting in a vicious cycle of taxation, decreased productivity, the declining economy, and the government raising taxes even higher. Land also became a problem when small independent farmers slowly evolved into few large landowners. This was because the poor and working class had become heavily taxed while the rich stayed rich for providing service to the state. This made a large gap between the rich and poor in Western Rome and caused the poor to turn to working for elites, making them even wealthier and more influential than the government.
The West and the East had many political problems, but the West couldn't fix the issues while the East had enough power to do so. There was a constant shift of power because many emperors were assassinated. The military lost control, so they couldn't put down the barbarian rebellions. The Roman Empire had a lot of problems with the officials and the constant shifts in power. Officials started to gain more and more and more land and did not have to pay taxes. This decreased the power of the central government. The government was not able to control the officials and pay the army. They had to pay the army so that they could keep their power, but because of the decrease in tax revenue, the soldiers were upset about how much they were paid. The soldiers would try to have their own generals become the emperor. Because of this, there were many emperors, and most of them were assassinated. Rome would have an emperor who was killed, and then a new emperor who was killed, and then another emperor. Rome went from emperor to emperor, each for a short period of time. There were many wars and rebellions over who got to be emperor. One of the big problems was that the military lost control. There was a shortage of manpower because of depopulation, and to make up for that, they recruited more barbarians. The Roman army had recruited barbarians before, but because of the loss of recruits, they had to increase the amount of barbarians in the ranks. Both the East and the West recruited barbarians, but the East had more control over them while the West didn't. The West made the barbarian soldiers part of their army, but not full-time, while the East made them regular soldiers. They Romanized the barbarians, and some of them were more Roman than the Romans. When the barbarians started to cause problems, the East killed them and were weakened, but they were able to stay stable and used both their army and diplomacy to defend themselves. The West didn't get rid of them or stop recruiting them, and they depended more and more on the barbarians, but were overly confident about the control they had over them. The West tried killing them, but because of poor planning and timing, they were left defenseless, and the barbarians gained more power. Another problem was how they trained their soldiers. They didn't. Most of the army was barbarians who had to learn Roman war strategies. They still used the Roman formations, which they couldn't use properly because of the lack of training. The West didn't establish control over the barbarian soldiers or properly train them, so eventually the army fell apart because of rebellions and bad defenses.
Rome's downfall can be compared to both the Persian and Han empires. Inflation was a large cause of the fall of Persia, as kings would hoard gold and less money would be in circulation. Additionally, the satraps in charge of the different areas became too powerful and made grabs for power. A lot of the trade that was going on came to a screeching halt due to these issues. Han China's downfall stemmed from their bureaucrats being too powerful, which sparked another war in states period. Additionally, internal conflicts between multiple parties stopped a lot of the Han's progress. The fall of the Western Empire ultimately came down to three causes: Diocletian's split of the empire and the conflict that followed, Rome's economic fragmentation into estates, and a weakened military and government. Although none of these alone would have caused the fall, the pressures that all of them forced upon the government and people were enough to make it crack. The economic fragmentation of the Western Empire was mainly due to how the West lost a lot of wealth from the split, as well as various raids by barbarians. These events forced the government to tax the poor more heavily, but there wasn't enough money to be paid. People turned to estates for work, which grew in power over time due to the large pools of labor and relative independence. Diocletian's reforms, although they ended conflict for several decades, ultimately affected Rome in a negative way. By separating the East, the West had no longer valuable resources and lost a lot of military power. The East could thrive compared to the West due to their established trade routes and good positioning. The split also left the West more vulnerable to the Germanic tribesmen. The barbarization of the military and growing effect of the Germanic tribesmen meant that the government was in constant turmoil. The barbarians that were integrated into Roman society demanded for power over time, and eventually they controlled quite a bit of the Western Empire. These three sources of conflict were the main reason that Rome fell, and although they had been happening on a smaller scale previously, they ended up causing the end of Rome when all three were present. Similar to many other empires of the era, Rome fell due to the flawed system that they had created.